When the well-dressed club manager looked at the tall man in simple jeans and a plain button-down shirt standing at the entrance of Boston's most exclusive establishment, he never imagined he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. The stranger's weathered hands and humble appearance masked a legend that had dominated basketball courts across America for over a decade. What happened next would turn an ordinary Tuesday evening into a story that would echo through the halls of sports history forever. Comment where you're watching from today, because this tale of respect, recognition, and remarkable redemption is about to unfold in ways you never expected. The Crimson Club stood like a fortress of privilege on Newbury Street, its mahogany doors gleaming under the warm glow of antique brass fixtures. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across imported Italian marble floors, while the soft murmur of influential conversations mixed with the gentle clinking of expensive crystal. The air carried the rich aroma of aged whiskey and hand-rolled cigars, creating an atmosphere that whispered of power, prestige, and exclusivity. Oil paintings of distinguished gentlemen from bygone eras gazed down from the walls, their stern expressions seeming to judge anyone who dared enter this sacred space of Boston's elite. It was here, on this particular evening in the spring of 1987, that destiny would weave together the paths of two very different men. The club's membership roster read like a who's who of New England society: politicians, business magnates, old money families whose names graced hospital wings and university buildings. These were people accustomed to getting their way, to being recognized wherever they went, to never having to explain who they were or why they belonged. The evening had started like any other at the Crimson Club. Distinguished members settled into their usual leather armchairs, discussing mergers and acquisitions over 30-year-old scotch. The staff moved with practiced precision, anticipating every need before it was voiced. This was a world where tradition ruled supreme, where unwritten rules determined who was welcome and who was not. Into this carefully orchestrated environment walked a man whose presence would soon disrupt everything. Larry Bird had just finished a grueling practice session with the Boston Celtics, his body still aching from the intense preparation for the upcoming playoffs. At 30 years old, he had already established himself as one of basketball's greatest players, but on this evening, he looked like any other working man heading home after a long day. His blonde hair was slightly disheveled, his clothes casual and comfortable rather than fashionable. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, unaware that his simple appearance would soon become the catalyst for an extraordinary confrontation. Larry had been invited to the Crimson Club by Jonathan Whitmore, a longtime friend and successful businessman who had grown up in the same small Indiana town. Whitmore understood the world of elite social clubs, having navigated their complex hierarchies for years to build his investment firm. He had specifically chosen this venue to celebrate a recent business victory, knowing that Larry preferred quiet, understated gatherings to flashy parties. The plan was simple: a quiet dinner between old friends, away from the spotlight that constantly followed one of Boston's most beloved athletes. As Larry approached the club's imposing entrance, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between this world and the one he had grown up in. French Lick, Indiana, was a place where a man was judged by his character and work ethic, not by the designer labels on his clothes or the size of his bank account. His mother, Georgia Bird, had raised him and his siblings with values that emphasized humility, respect, and treating everyone equally regardless of their station in life. These lessons had shaped him into a man who remained remarkably down to earth despite achieving unprecedented success in professional sports. The heavy mahogany door swung open as Larry stepped inside, and immediately he felt the weight of curious stares. The club's entrance hall was designed to intimidate, with its soaring ceiling and grand staircase leading to the private dining rooms above. A massive crystal chandelier dominated the space, its light reflecting off the polished marble floor, in brilliant patterns that seemed to emphasize the opulence surrounding every surface. Behind the ornate reception desk stood Reginald Ashford, the club's head manager, a man who took immense pride in his ability to instantly assess the social standing of anyone who walked through those doors. Ashford had built his reputation on maintaining the Crimson Club's exclusivity, ensuring that only the most distinguished individuals gained access to its hallowed halls. His sharp eyes had been trained over 20 years of service to spot the subtle markers of true wealth and breeding, the cut of a jacket, the quality of leather shoes, the confidence that came from generations of privilege. What Ashford saw when he looked at Larry Bird was everything he had been trained to exclude. The simple jeans, while clean and well-fitted, bore no designer labels. The button-down shirt was obviously off the rack, lacking the bespoke tailoring that marked true sophistication. The worn leather boots spoke of utility rather than fashion, and the man's overall appearance suggested someone who worked with his hands rather than commanded boardrooms. Ashford's expression remained professionally neutral, but his mind was already calculating the best way to handle this obvious mistake. Clearly, this individual had somehow confused the Crimson Club with one of the more common establishments that catered to tourists and locals. It happened occasionally, and Ashford prided himself on resolving such situations with tact and discretion, protecting both the club's reputation and the dignity of the confused visitor. As other patrons continued their conversations in the background, the atmosphere began to shift subtly. Several members had noticed the interaction at the front desk, their curiosity piqued by the presence of someone who so obviously didn't fit the club's usual profile. Whispered conversations began behind raised newspapers and crystal glasses, as eyes darted between Larry and the manager, who was clearly preparing to address what he perceived as an uncomfortable situation. Larry himself remained completely unaware of the storm that was brewing around him. He had learned long ago to tune out the noise and distractions that came with fame, focusing instead on the simple pleasure of spending time with good friends. His thoughts were on the conversation he would soon have with Whitmore about their shared memories of growing up in Indiana, about the values they had learned from their hard-working parents, and about how those lessons had shaped their very different but equally successful careers. The irony of the situation was lost on everyone present except perhaps Larry himself, who had grown accustomed to being underestimated based on his appearance. Throughout his basketball career, opponents had made the mistake of assuming that his unassuming demeanor meant he lacked competitive fire. They learned quickly that beneath his quiet exterior burned an intensity and determination that had carried him to 3 NBA championships and 2 MVP awards. But here, in this temple of social status, those achievements meant nothing if they weren't immediately visible in his clothing or demeanor. Ashford cleared his throat delicately, preparing to deliver what he believed would be a face-saving rejection that would allow this obvious interloper to exit gracefully without causing a scene. He had perfected this particular speech over the years, striking just the right balance between firmness and politeness that would make it clear that certain standards had to be maintained while avoiding any suggestion of deliberate rudeness. The tension in the room continued to build as other club members became increasingly aware that something significant was unfolding at the entrance. Conversations grew quieter as attention shifted toward the front desk, where 2 worlds were about to collide in a way that would challenge everything these privileged individuals thought they knew about worth, respect, and the true meaning of distinction. In the background, the club's other staff members went about their duties, unaware that they were about to witness a confrontation that would become the stuff of legend. The bartender continued polishing glasses with mechanical precision. The servers prepared for the evening rush, and the kitchen staff put finishing touches on meals that cost more than many people earned in a week. All of them would soon discover that their carefully ordered world was about to be turned upside down by a man who looked like he might be more comfortable in a small-town diner than in Boston's most exclusive club. Larry stood patiently, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the ornate clock on the wall tick toward his appointed meeting time with Whitmore. He had no idea that every second that passed was building toward a moment that would test not only his own character, but the character of everyone around him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true nature of respect, the power of assumptions, and the difference between earned distinction and inherited privilege. The Crimson Club's atmosphere of quiet sophistication was about to be shattered by a collision between two very different value systems, one based on appearances and social standing, the other rooted in genuine achievement and humble excellence. What happened next would become a story told and retold wherever people gathered to discuss the moments when true character reveals itself in the face of prejudice and misunderstanding. As Ashford prepared to speak, neither he nor Larry could have imagined that this seemingly simple interaction would become a defining moment that would be remembered long after both men had left the building. The wheels of an extraordinary confrontation were already in motion, set to unfold in ways that would surprise everyone present and create ripples that would extend far beyond the mahogany walls of Boston's most exclusive establishment. Reginald Ashford straightened his silk tie and approached Larry with the practiced precision of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of exclusion. His polished Oxford shoes clicked against the marble floor with a rhythm that seemed to announce his authority over this sacred space. Behind him, the ornate grandfather clock chimed 7:30, its deep resonance filling the momentary silence that had fallen over the entrance hall. Several club members had lowered their newspapers just enough to observe the unfolding drama, their curiosity piqued by the obvious mismatch between the visitor and their exclusive environment. The manager's voice carried the refined accent of someone educated at the finest institutions, each word carefully modulated to convey both sophistication and subtle condescension. His eyes swept over Larry's appearance once more, taking in every detail that confirmed his initial assessment. The absence of a proper blazer, the lack of Italian leather shoes, the casual demeanor that suggested someone unfamiliar with the protocols of high society, all of these elements reinforced Ashford's conviction that he was dealing with someone who had simply wandered into the wrong establishment. Ashford cleared his throat with the delicate precision of a classical musician preparing for a solo performance. His hands were clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested both authority and restraint, a stance he had perfected during his years of managing delicate social situations. The ambient lighting caught the gold cufflinks at his wrists, small but significant markers of his position within this carefully structured hierarchy. The club's atmosphere seemed to hold its breath as Ashford prepared to speak. Behind them, the gentle clinking of crystal glasses continued, but the conversations had grown noticeably quieter. Regular patrons who had witnessed countless such interactions over the years recognized the familiar pattern that was about to unfold. They had seen Ashford handle similar situations with diplomatic finesse, always managing to maintain the club's standards while preserving everyone's dignity. What none of them realized was that they were about to witness something entirely different from the routine rejections they had observed in the past. The man standing before Ashford possessed a quiet strength that had been forged in gymnasiums across America, tempered by countless battles on basketball courts where respect was earned through performance rather than pedigree. Larry's composure was not born of ignorance about social hierarchies, but from a deep confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he had accomplished. Ashford began his carefully rehearsed speech with the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He explained the club's membership requirements with practiced efficiency, outlining the extensive vetting process that potential members underwent before being granted access to these prestigious premises. His words were chosen to emphasize the exclusivity of the establishment, while suggesting that perhaps the visitor might find more suitable accommodations elsewhere in the city. As Ashford spoke, Larry listened with the same focused attention he brought to studying game film or analyzing opponent strategies. His expression remained neutral, neither defensive nor challenging, but there was something in his steady gaze that suggested depths the manager had not yet recognized. Larry's hands remained relaxed at his sides, his posture comfortable and unthreatened by the implications of what he was hearing. The irony of the situation would have been apparent to anyone familiar with Larry's background and achievements. Here was a man who had been personally recruited by some of the most exclusive organizations in professional sports, who had been courted by corporate executives and celebrity endorsement deals worth millions of dollars. Yet none of that mattered in this moment, because those accomplishments were invisible to someone who measured worth solely through external appearances and social connections. Other club members began to take more obvious notice of the interaction, unfolding at the entrance. Abigail De Leon, a prominent socialite whose family had been members since the club's founding, adjusted her pearl necklace nervously as she watched the scene develop. She prided herself on recognizing important figures in Boston society, but this particular individual remained a mystery to her carefully catalogued mental directory of significant personalities. Near the bar, Alan Johnson paused his conversation with fellow investment banker Christopher Fletcher to observe the subtle drama playing out across the room. Both men had built their careers on reading people and situations quickly, and something about this particular confrontation struck them as different from the routine social corrections they had witnessed in the past. There was an quality to the stranger's demeanor that suggested hidden depths, a composure that seemed to come from genuine confidence rather than ignorance. Ashford continued his explanation with growing conviction, citing the club's dress code, requirements, and the necessity of maintaining certain standards in an establishment that served Boston's most distinguished citizens. He gestured subtly toward the other patrons, drawing attention to their impeccable attire and obvious comfort. Within these refined surroundings, the implication was clear, without being explicitly stated. This was not a place for casual visitors or those unfamiliar with the expectations of high society. Larry's response, when it finally came, was delivered with the same measured tone he used during post-game interviews with the media. He explained that he was expected by Jonathan Whitmore, mentioning his friend's name with the casual familiarity of someone who had known him since childhood. The name carried significant weight within the club's social hierarchy. Whitmore was not only a successful businessman, but also a longtime member whose family connections ran deep within Boston's financial community. Ashford's confident demeanor wavered slightly at the mention of Whitmore's name, but his commitment to the club's standards remained unwavering. He suggested that perhaps there had been some misunderstanding, that possibly the visitor was meant to meet his friend at a different establishment. The implication was diplomatic but unmistakable. Surely someone of Whitmore's standing would not have invited someone so obviously inappropriate to such an exclusive venue. The tension in the room continued to escalate as other staff members began to take notice of the prolonged conversation at the entrance. Amy Bartlett, the club's head hostess, approached discreetly to offer assistance, her trained eye immediately assessing the situation and concluding that Ashford was handling a delicate matter with his usual professionalism. Her presence added another layer of authority to the manager's position, reinforcing the institutional weight behind his decision. Meanwhile, Larry remained remarkably calm throughout the exchange, displaying none of the indignation or frustration that might have been expected from someone facing such obvious discrimination. His composure was born from years of dealing with skeptics and doubters who had underestimated his abilities based on preconceived notions. Throughout his basketball career, he had encountered opponents and critics who dismissed him because he didn't fit their image of what a superstar athlete should look like or how he should behave. The club's other patrons continued to watch with growing fascination as the standoff developed. Anna Church, a prominent art dealer whose gallery catered to Boston's cultural elite, found herself increasingly intrigued by the stranger's unflappable demeanor. There was something about his bearing that suggested hidden significance, a quality she had learned to recognize in her dealings with artists and collectors who possessed talents that weren't immediately visible to casual observers. Ashford decided to escalate his approach, suggesting that even if the visitor had been invited by a member, proper protocol required advance notice and approval from the club's membership committee. He explained this process with the air of someone citing sacred law, emphasizing that these procedures existed to maintain the institution's reputation and ensure the comfort of all members. His tone carried the weight of decades of tradition, implying that these rules had been established by wiser minds and could not be bent for individual convenience. Larry listened to this additional explanation with the same patient attention he had shown throughout the encounter. His lack of visible reaction seemed to frustrate Ashford, who was accustomed to seeing some combination of embarrassment, anger, or defensive argumentation from those who found themselves in similar situations. Instead, he was faced with someone who appeared completely untroubled by the implications of what he was being told. The situation reached a new level of complexity when April Johnson, another longtime member, approached the group to inquire about the delay at the entrance. Her question was phrased with the delicate curiosity of someone who understood social protocols, but was genuinely puzzled by the extended nature of what should have been a routine interaction. Her presence added additional scrutiny to Ashford's handling of the situation, creating pressure to resolve the matter quickly and decisively. As the confrontation continued to develop, the underlying tension in the room became increasingly palpable. Regular patrons, who had initially paid little attention to the scene at the entrance, were now openly observing the exchange. Their conversations reduced to hushed whispers as they speculated about the identity of the mysterious visitor and the reasons for the prolonged discussion with management. Larry's calm persistence in the face of increasingly obvious rejection began to create ripples of uncertainty among the observing members. His refusal to be intimidated or embarrassed by the situation suggested a level of confidence that couldn't be easily explained by ignorance or social obliviousness. There was something about his bearing that implied familiarity with high pressure, situations and confidence in his own worth that transcended external appearances. Ashford found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as the situation attracted more attention than he had anticipated. His usual tactics for handling inappropriate visitors were proving ineffective against someone who refused to be embarrassed or intimidated into leaving quietly. The stranger's composed responses and steady demeanor were beginning to create doubt about the wisdom of his initial assessment. The club's atmosphere continued to shift as more members became aware of the unfolding drama. Conversations throughout the main hall had slowed as attention focused on the entrance, where what should have been a simple misunderstanding was developing into something more significant. The very fact that the interaction had continued for so long was beginning to suggest that there might be more to this situation than initially apparent. As the confrontation approached its climax, Neither Ashford nor the observing members could have imagined that they were about to witness a revelation that would fundamentally challenge their assumptions about worth, recognition, and the true meaning of distinction. The stage was set for a moment of truth that would expose the limitations of judging people based solely on appearances and social markers. The clock continued to tick toward the appointed meeting time, and somewhere in the club's private dining rooms, Jonathan Whitmore was growing concerned about his friend's delayed arrival. Soon, the carefully constructed world of assumptions and prejudices that had shaped this confrontation would come crashing down, replaced by a reality that none of the participants had anticipated. The atmosphere in the Crimson Club's entrance hall had reached a breaking point when Jonathan Whitmore descended the grand staircase, his polished Italian leather shoes creating a rhythmic cadence against the marble steps that seemed to announce the arrival of someone accustomed to command attention. His navy blazer bore the subtle insignia of his membership pin, a small golden emblem that marked him as one of the club's most respected patrons. Whitmore's expression shifted from casual concern to visible alarm as he observed the crowd that had gathered around the reception desk, his longtime friend standing at the center of what appeared to be an increasingly tense confrontation. Whitmore had been waiting in the club's private Wellington room, a luxurious dining space reserved for the most distinguished members and their guests. The room's hand-painted wallpaper depicted scenes of English fox hunts, while crystal decanters filled with aged spirits caught the light from authentic Georgian silver candelabras. He had specifically chosen this venue to celebrate a recent merger that had elevated his investment firm to new heights of success, knowing that Larry would appreciate the quiet elegance over flashier alternatives that might attract unwanted attention from sports media. As Whitmore approached the group, he could see that Reginald Ashford had positioned himself with the authority of someone defending sacred territory. The manager's posture radiated the confidence of a man who believed he was protecting the club's reputation from an obvious interloper. Behind Ashford, several staff members had gathered in a show of institutional solidarity, their pressed uniforms and professional bearing creating an imposing wall of establishment authority. The crowd of observing members had grown substantially during the prolonged confrontation. Ariel May, a prominent philanthropist whose family had endowed multiple wings of Boston's most prestigious hospitals, stood near the mahogany paneling with barely concealed fascination. Her diamond earrings caught the chandelier light as she leaned slightly forward, straining to hear every word of the exchange that had captivated the attention of nearly everyone in the immediate vicinity. Barbara Jackson, whose late husband had been a founding partner of one of Boston's most successful law firms, adjusted her silk scarf nervously as she watched the scene unfold. She prided herself on maintaining the social graces that had been instilled in her at finishing school decades earlier, but this particular situation seemed to defy the conventional protocols she had mastered over years of navigating elite social circles. Whitmore's voice cut through the tension with the authority of someone accustomed to resolving complex business negotiations. His tone carried the perfect balance of respect for the establishment and protective concern for his friend, demonstrating the diplomatic skills that had made him successful in both professional and social environments. He addressed Ashford by name, immediately establishing his status as an insider, while making it clear that the situation required immediate clarification. The manager's expression underwent a subtle but significant transformation as he recognized the approaching figure. Whitmore's reputation within the club was impeccable. His family had been members for 3 generations, his business acumen was widely respected, and his charitable contributions to various Boston institutions had earned him considerable social capital. More importantly, his judgment in matters of social propriety had never been questioned, making his apparent endorsement of this controversial visitor particularly puzzling. Ashford found himself caught between conflicting imperatives as he attempted to reconcile his assessment of the inappropriate visitor with Whitmore's obvious intention to vouch for him. The manager's training had taught him to defer to members' wishes whenever possible, but his primary responsibility remained protecting the club's exclusivity and maintaining standards that had been carefully cultivated over generations of distinguished service. Larry observed the interaction between his friend and the club manager with the same analytical attention he brought to studying opposing teams' defensive strategies. He could see the complex calculations taking place in Ashford's expression as the man struggled to reassess a situation that had seemed straightforward just moments earlier. The arrival of a respected member had introduced variables that threatened to undermine the manager's confident handling of what he had assumed was a simple case of misplaced tourism. Other club members began to murmur among themselves as they witnessed Whitmore's intervention on behalf of the mysterious stranger. Cole Harris, a successful real estate developer whose projects had transformed significant portions of downtown Boston, exchanged meaningful glances with fellow member Corey Anderson, a prominent surgeon whose family had social connections reaching back to the city's founding families. The conversation between Whitmore and Ashford took on the careful formality of a diplomatic negotiation as both men sought to preserve their respective positions while finding a face-saving resolution to an increasingly complex situation. Whitmore explained that his guest was not only invited, but specifically expected, emphasizing the personal nature of their friendship and the celebratory purpose of their planned dinner meeting. Ashford listened to this explanation with growing discomfort as he realized that his initial assessment might have been fundamentally flawed. The possibility that he had spent the better part of 30 minutes attempting to exclude a legitimate guest of one of the club's most respected members created a crisis that threatened both his professional reputation and the institution's carefully maintained atmosphere of refined hospitality. The tension in the room reached new heights as other staff members began to recognize the implications of the unfolding drama. Amy Bartlett, the head hostess, retreated discreetly to avoid being associated with what appeared to be a significant error in judgment, while younger staff members exchanged nervous glances as they witnessed their supervisor's authority being challenged by circumstances beyond his control. Larry maintained his characteristic composure throughout the increasingly awkward exchange, displaying none of the vindication or satisfaction that might have been expected from someone who had endured nearly 40 minutes of polite but unmistakable rejection. His expression remained neutral and patient, as if he understood that the situation would resolve itself naturally without requiring dramatic intervention or emotional confrontation. The gathered members continued to watch with fascination as the power dynamics in the room shifted subtly but unmistakably. What had begun as a routine exclusion of an inappropriate visitor was transforming into something far more complex and potentially embarrassing for the club's management. Several patrons who had initially supported Ashford's position through their approving nods and whispered comments now found themselves questioning their hasty judgments. Darrell Reynolds, a prominent art collector whose acquisitions had been featured in multiple museum exhibitions, began to study Larry's face more carefully as doubts about the stranger's identity started to emerge. There was something familiar about the man's features, something that suggested significance beyond the casual appearance that had triggered the initial confrontation. Ashford attempted to maintain his authority by explaining the club's policies regarding advance notification for guests, suggesting that proper protocols required written confirmation at least 24 hours before any planned visit. His voice carried less conviction than before, however, as the presence of an established member defending the visitor undermined the foundation of his original position. Whitmore responded to these procedural objections with the patient firmness of someone accustomed to navigating bureaucratic obstacles in high-stakes business environments. He acknowledged the importance of club policies while making it clear that exceptional circumstances sometimes required flexible interpretation of established guidelines. His tone suggested that he expected reasonable accommodation based on his long-standing membership and exemplary record within the organization. The confrontation reached a new level of complexity when Darren Garcia, a prominent sports journalist, whose columns appeared in several major publications, suddenly recognized the face that had been nagging at his memory throughout the extended drama. His sharp intake of breath was audible across the entrance hall, and his expression of sudden recognition sent ripples of curiosity through the observing crowd. Other members began to lean forward with renewed interest as they sensed that a significant revelation was about to emerge from what had seemed like a routine social correction. The possibility that they had been witnessing something far more significant than a simple case of mistaken venue began to dawn on several of the more perceptive observers. Larry noticed the sports journalist's reaction with the quiet awareness of someone who had spent years dealing with media attention and public recognition. He understood that his anonymity in this particular environment was about to end, transforming the dynamic of the confrontation in ways that would surprise everyone who had participated in or observed the extended drama. Ashford sensed the shift in atmosphere even before he understood its cause. His years of experience reading social situations alerting him to the fact that something fundamental had changed in the room's energy. The confidence that had sustained him through decades of similar encounters began to waver as he realized that he might be dealing with circumstances far beyond his usual experience. The club's ornate grandfather clock chimed 8 times, marking an hour since Larry's initial arrival and highlighting the extraordinary duration of what should have been a brief interaction. The extended nature of the confrontation had attracted the attention of virtually every patron in the immediate vicinity, creating an audience for what was about to become one of the most memorable scenes in the establishment's distinguished history. As Garcia stepped forward with obvious recognition dawning in his expression, the carefully constructed world of assumptions and prejudices that had shaped the evening's events was about to collapse entirely. The revelation of Larry's true identity would transform him from an unwelcome intruder into one of the most celebrated figures in Boston sports history, creating a moment of reckoning that would challenge everyone present to reconsider their understanding of worth, respect, and the dangerous limitations of judging people based solely on appearances. Darren Garcia stepped forward through the crowd of onlookers, his press credentials gleaming on a lanyard around his neck as recognition flooded his features with unmistakable certainty. His voice carried the authority of someone who had covered Boston sports for over 15 years, witnessing countless moments of athletic greatness from courtside seats at the Garden. The words that emerged from his lips seemed to hang in the air like thunder before a lightning strike, transforming the entire atmosphere of the Crimson Club's entrance hall in a single, devastating moment of revelation. "That's Larry Bird," Garcia announced with quiet conviction, his voice cutting through the murmur of confused conversations like a blade through silk. "That's Larry Legend himself. 3-time NBA champion, 3-time MVP, 12-time All-Star. You've just spent the last hour trying to turn away one of the greatest basketball players in history, and quite possibly the most beloved athlete in Boston sports." The effect of this revelation was immediate and profound, rippling through the gathered crowd like shockwaves from an earthquake's epicenter. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as dozens of distinguished faces turned toward Larry with expressions ranging from disbelief to dawning horror as they realized the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The silence that followed Garcia's announcement was so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo through the marble halls with the persistence of a funeral drum. Reginald Ashford's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical under different circumstances, the color draining from his cheeks as if someone had opened a valve and allowed his confidence to pour out onto the polished floor. His carefully maintained composure crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane as he realized that he had not only insulted a guest of one of the club's most respected members, but had spent nearly an hour attempting to exclude someone whose athletic achievements had brought glory to the entire city of Boston. The manager's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, his usual eloquence deserting him completely as he struggled to process the implications of his monumental error in judgment. His eyes darted between Larry's calm face and the growing crowd of members, whose expressions ranged from fascination to barely concealed amusement at witnessing such a spectacular reversal of fortune. Barbara Jackson gasped audibly, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her throat as she realized she was standing in the presence of genuine sports royalty. She had attended countless Celtics games during the team's championship runs of the 1980s, cheering from premium seats as Larry Bird orchestrated victories with the same quiet intensity he had displayed throughout this entire confrontation. Ariel May felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment as she recalled her earlier dismissive glances toward the man she had assumed was some sort of working-class interloper who had wandered into their exclusive sanctuary. The irony was not lost on her that she had been looking at someone whose salary during his playing career had likely exceeded the annual income of most club members, someone whose endorsement deals and business ventures had established him as one of the most financially successful athletes of his generation. Cole Harris stepped forward with the enthusiasm of a true sports fan, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine excitement at finding himself in the presence of a living legend. He had been a season ticket holder during the epic battles between the Celtics and Lakers, witnessing firsthand the incredible performances that had established Larry Bird as one of basketball's immortal figures. The revelation continued to spread through the club like wildfire as members who had not witnessed the initial confrontation began to gather around the entrance hall. Inner Church practically trembled with excitement as she realized she was standing near someone whose athletic accomplishments had become part of Boston's cultural heritage, whose rivalry with Magic Johnson had defined an entire era of professional basketball. Jonathan Whitmore watched his friend's vindication with a mixture of pride and amusement, having known exactly how this scenario would unfold from the moment he witnessed the confrontation at the reception desk. He had seen Larry handle similar situations countless times over the years, always maintaining his dignity and composure while allowing others to reveal their own character through their actions and assumptions. Larry himself remained characteristically humble throughout the dramatic revelation, showing none of the triumph or vindication that lesser men might have displayed in similar circumstances. His expression remained kind and patient, as if he understood that moments like these were teaching opportunities rather than chances for personal revenge or embarrassment of others. Ashford finally found his voice, stammering an apology that seemed to encompass not only his own behavior, but the collective misjudgment of everyone who had participated in or witnessed the extended confrontation. His words came in a rush of genuine remorse and professional horror as he realized that his attempt to protect the club's exclusivity had resulted in the most embarrassing incident of his 20-year career. The manager's apology was heartfelt, but clumsy, filled with references to misunderstandings and procedural errors that everyone present knew were inadequate explanations for what had actually occurred. The truth was obvious to everyone in the room. Assumptions had been made based solely on appearance, and those assumptions had led to a spectacular failure of judgment that would be remembered long after the evening ended. Other staff members began to appear from various corners of the club as word of the revelation spread through the building like lightning. Amy Bartlett returned to the scene with obvious mortification, her professional training warring with her desire to somehow undo the damage that had been done to the establishment's reputation through this public display of prejudice and poor judgment. Larry graciously accepted Ashford's stammered apologies with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, demonstrating the character that had made him beloved by teammates, opponents, and fans throughout his illustrious career. His response was measured and kind, acknowledging the manager's distress while making it clear that no lasting harm had been done. The basketball legend's gracious handling of the situation only served to highlight the contrast between his genuine class and the superficial sophistication that had been on display earlier in the evening. Here was someone who had earned his status through years of dedication, hard work, and exceptional performance, responding to prejudice and disrespect with the kind of dignity that could not be purchased or inherited. Darren Garcia began to share stories of Larry's legendary performances with the growing crowd of fascinated members, recounting famous games and clutch shots that had become part of Boston sports folklore. His enthusiastic narrative painted a picture of athletic greatness that made the earlier attempts at exclusion seem not just wrong, but absurdly inappropriate. The sports journalist described Larry's rookie season when he transformed a struggling Celtics franchise into championship contenders almost overnight. He spoke of the incredible work ethic that had driven Larry to arrive at practice facilities hours before his teammates, perfecting shots and studying game film with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Garcia's stories continued with accounts of Larry's legendary trash-talking and psychological warfare against opponents, his ability to back up bold predictions with clutch performances that demoralized even the most confident competitors. The journalist painted a picture of someone who combined supreme athletic talent with an unshakable mental toughness that had been forged in the small gyms and playgrounds of rural Indiana. The crowd listened with rapt attention as Garcia described the famous 1987 playoffs, when Larry had played through incredible pain and exhaustion to lead the Celtics toward another championship run. The timing was particularly relevant, as those very playoffs were just weeks away, making Larry's presence in Boston especially significant for the team's preparation and fan excitement. Several members began to share their own memories of attending Celtics games during Larry's prime years, describing the electric atmosphere at Boston Garden when he took the court. Their stories created a collective narrative of shared city pride and athletic excellence that made the earlier confrontation seem even more embarrassing in retrospect. Elizabeth Thompson recalled watching Larry's famous steal against the Detroit Pistons in the 1987 Eastern Conference Finals, a play that had been replayed countless times on sports highlights and had become synonymous with clutch performance under ultimate pressure. Her vivid description of being in the arena during that historic moment added another layer of context to Larry's legendary status. Emily Bender mentioned her children's excitement when they had spotted Larry at a local restaurant several months earlier, describing how graciously he had signed autographs and posed for pictures despite being interrupted during a private meal. Her story reinforced the image of someone who understood his role as a public figure while maintaining genuine humility and kindness toward fans. The atmosphere in the club had transformed completely from the tense confrontation of an hour earlier to something resembling a spontaneous celebration of athletic greatness and Boston sports history. Members who had initially supported the manager's exclusionary tactics now seemed eager to distance themselves from those positions while associating themselves with the excitement of meeting a genuine sports legend. Larry handled the attention with characteristic grace, answering questions about the upcoming playoffs and sharing insights about the team's preparation and goals. His responses revealed the same analytical intelligence that had made him such an effective player, breaking down complex strategic concepts in ways that even casual fans could understand and appreciate. Jonathan Whitmore finally intervened to suggest that perhaps they should move to their reserved dining room, where they could continue their conversation away from the growing crowd of excited members and curious staff. His suggestion was delivered with diplomatic skill, providing Larry with an escape from the impromptu fan gathering while allowing the club to return to its normal atmosphere of refined calm. As the two friends prepared to leave the entrance hall, Larry turned back to address Reginald Ashford directly, offering words of understanding and forgiveness that demonstrated the character traits that had made him respected throughout the basketball world. His comments were brief but profound, acknowledging that everyone makes mistakes while emphasizing the importance of treating all people with basic dignity and respect. Larry's final words to the assembled crowd carried a message that transcended sports and social status, speaking to universal values of character, humility, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the worth that exists in every individual. His impromptu speech was delivered without pretension or condescension, coming from someone who had learned these lessons through his own experiences of being underestimated and dismissed. The basketball legend concluded by expressing his appreciation for the warm welcome he had ultimately received, choosing to focus on the positive aspects of the evening rather than dwelling on the initial misunderstandings. His graciousness in victory revealed the same class that had made him beloved by fans and respected by opponents throughout his career. As Larry and Jonathan disappeared up the grand staircase toward their private dining room, the crowd in the entrance hall began to disperse slowly, their conversations filled with excited recounting of what they had just witnessed. Many members immediately began calling friends and family to share the story of the evening when Larry Bird had been initially turned away from the Crimson Club, only to transform the confrontation into a lesson about respect, character, and the dangerous limitations of judging people based on appearances. Reginald Ashford remained at his post behind the reception desk, his usual confidence replaced by a newfound humility as he contemplated the lessons of the evening. The manager had learned that true distinction could not always be recognized through external markers, and that sometimes the most extraordinary people appeared in the most ordinary packaging. The story of Larry Bird's encounter at the Crimson Club would be retold countless times in the days and weeks that followed, becoming part of Boston sports legend and a cautionary tale about the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. It had become a perfect example of how genuine greatness often reveals itself not through demanding recognition, but through maintaining character and composure in the face of prejudice and misunderstanding. The evening had transformed from a routine social gathering into an unforgettable lesson about character, respect, and the true meaning of distinction. Larry Bird had once again proven that legends are not just made on basketball courts, but in moments when character is tested and grace prevails over pride. Has anyone ever underestimated you based on your appearance? Share your stories in the comments below, and remember that true greatness often comes in humble packages. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are those who never feel the need to announce their accomplishments to the world.